Let's begin. My name is Richard Weitz. I'm the director in the Center for Political and Military Affairs here at the Hudson Institute. Thank you so much for coming. It's good to see you all here. Hudson is very pleased to support yet another panel dealing with nuclear security issues. In this whole series, we're grateful for the Connect US Fund for supporting this effort. The topic today couldn't be more important. It's on what the next steps to prevent nuclear terrorism. I was at the Pentagon in 9/11. We all remember that day and and that was just a sort of conventional terrorism, if by unconventional means. Just think what would be if the terrorists gained control of some kind of WMD material, be it nuclear or other. And the administration has, just as in the Bush administration, so the Obama administration is making a great effort to try and address weaknesses we've seen in this area, building a series of layered defenses. The most recent initiative is the Nuclear Security Summit that occurred in Seoul, which called for additional measures to secure radiological nuclear materials. We're very pleased to have probably some of the leading experts in the United States, if not the world, here to tell us about what kind of steps we can take in the future to deal with this issue. After they speak, there'll be time for questions and answers. This is being streamed live, so please turn off any communication devices you have at this point, and I can take questions over the internet, and I'll explain how to do that when we reach the question and answer session. The first speaker will be Thomas Countryman, who is Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation. He is a career member of the Foreign Service with the rank of Minister Counselor. His ISN bureau is really at the point end of the spear in dealing with how to confront keeping weapons of mass destruction, their means of delivery, and related materials out of the hands of terrorists. After him, we're fortunate and we're going to have both of the co-chairs of the Fissile Material Working Group, which is a non-governmental coalition of more than 70 U.S. international organizations that are committed to improve fissile material to improve public policies designed to prevent nuclear terrorism. Ken Luongo is president of the Partnership for Global Security, and he served many years in the Department of Energy before he's now heading his NGO. Miles Pomper is a senior research associate for the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. He deals with a variety of nuclear issues, nuclear energy, nonproliferation, security, arms control. And previously, he was editor-in-chief of probably one of the leading journals in the field, Arms Control Today. So join me in welcoming them, and we're going to have a great session.
Let me thank the Hudson Institute and you, Richard, for this invitation and the opportunity to give some public information about an important priority of ours. The Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation, ISN, concentrates on a particular aspect of security and anti-terrorism, the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, that is nuclear, biological, radiological, chemical weapons, as well as the prevention of illicit transfers of conventional weapons and dual-use items. Our mandate for action in this field comes directly from President Obama, who called the threat of nuclear terrorism the most immediate and extreme threat to global security, and emphasized the need for enhanced tools to prevent nuclear smuggling and remove nuclear material from the black market. I will discuss briefly some of the progress we made at the 2012 Nuclear Security Summit in Seoul, and then turn to the specific State Department initiatives designed to address nuclear smuggling. The Nuclear Security Summits in Washington in 2010 and in Seoul in 2012 are a key component of the President's efforts to work with partner nations to strengthen the security of nuclear materials globally. The Seoul Summit was the largest ever presidential-level gathering, and it discussed international measures to protect nuclear facilities and materials from terrorist groups. 57 world leaders joined the President to advance a vision of a world free of the threat of nuclear terrorism. Since the first summit in 2010, the world's made great strides to prevent terrorists from acquiring nuclear weapons, but there is a lot more to do. Nuclear material remains at risk of exploitation by terrorists and criminal gangs that have an interest in acquiring it. We will keep working with our international partners to secure vulnerable nuclear and radiological material around the world and as part of advancing the President's agenda in nonproliferation. And the Netherlands, which is a strong leader in this field, will host the next Nuclear Security Summit in early 2014. Now, efforts to lock down nuclear materials worldwide, a key goal of these summits, have significantly increased global security. But the threat is still there. These materials can remain in illegal circulation on a black market. The IAEA illicit trafficking database has a key role in understanding the reports of nuclear and radiological material outside of legitimate control. Of the hundreds of incidents reported to the IAEA about unauthorized possession and related criminal activities since the database was established in 1995, we know that at least 17 incidents involved highly enriched uranium or plutonium. And no matter how infrequently these seizures of fissionable nuclear material occur, naturally these cases are the ones that worry us the most. Recent seizures of nuclear material suggest that additional material remains available on the black market and has to be located and secured. So the international community has to work together to recover nuclear and radioactive materials that remain outside legitimate control, to ensure that terrorists are never able to acquire them, and to provide adequate security for those materials that are still under state control. So, the specific State Department initiatives that seek to address this problem. First, in the framework of strengthening the global capacities to counter nuclear smuggling, we promote the establishment of national counter-nuclear smuggling teams, CNS teams. They focus on information collection and analysis, law enforcement, and technical reachback. When these are integrated together, they have been proven to be successful in detecting nuclear smuggling activities and arresting the individuals involved. Now, specifically, a national CNS team ought to include information collectors to gather data on the nuclear smuggling threat, intelligence analysts to review the information, to look for the connections between the current and the past cases, and to inform their decision makers. It must have law enforcement officers with arrest authority who can investigate the smugglers, arrest individuals involved, and ensure prosecution. And a key component is liaison officers under whatever title, who can coordinate the technical reach back to the national and international scientific community, report the material seizure to the international database through Interpol, through the IAEA, and provide data and information wherever appropriate, including to the press. So building these contacts across nations for the liaison officers is crucial. So the State Department, Department of Energy, FBI, and others have worked together to help partner countries strengthen their capabilities by constructing these teams. And within state, ISN's Office of Weapons of Mass Destruction Terrorism leads these engagements. So far, we have worked with several governments, Lithuania, Slovakia, and Ukraine, to establish these national teams and are moving ahead with others. A national CNS team would focus on smuggling activities that are active within a country's borders and would complement the fixed radiation detection equipment that a country has around its points of entry. We believe the key to detecting nuclear smuggling activities, recovering the black market materials, and making arrests are the following: improving the national capabilities to connect rapidly investigatory, intelligence, and technical information, rapidly sharing the urgent and relevant information through liaison officers with the relevant international actors, and working with Interpol to enhance global law enforcement cooperation and establishing a international law enforcement community of interest to counter these nuclear smuggling activities. So through these outreach activities and our broader programs, we work with foreign partners to accomplish these goals and to counter smuggling on the global scale. A second program is the Nuclear Smuggling Outreach Initiative, through which the United States uses our diplomatic channels to build partnerships with countries of special importance to the global effort against nuclear smuggling. We develop with each partner country under the NSOI a government-to-government joint action plan to identify specific steps to improve national capabilities to prevent, detect, and respond to nuclear smuggling. This plan is intended to be a comprehensive framework for all aspects of cooperation between our two governments to address nuclear smuggling. And of course, it includes not only the Department of State, but relevant efforts of our interagency partners, primarily DOE and again, FBI and other law enforcement. And as part of that effort, under NSOI, we develop with each partner government a list of assistance projects that will help that government implement its action plan. We design these again in coordination with other programs of the U.S. government that are already providing assistance to the partner government. And then we sign a joint action plan, and we look to the partner government to begin the implementation of the agreed steps, the ones it can carry out on its own, while we look for the correct U.S. programs and international donor partners to coordinate funding for the agreed assistance projects. We have right now joint action plans in force with 10 partner countries, 4 more are pending signature, and these 10 agreements have made significant progress on more than 200 specific steps to enhance their capabilities. We don't do this only the U.S. We have partnered with more than 15 other countries that have provided more than $60 million in assistance for those 10 countries. And we can point to significant tangible improvements in the counter-nuclear smuggling capabilities of these first 10 partners. I'll mention next PNSP. Haven't run out of letters yet. The Preventing Nuclear Smuggling program addresses critical gaps to counter smuggling identified through our engagement under NSOI by developing and implementing training and workshops. So PNSP gives very targeted assistance to help priority partners develop very specialized counter-smuggling capabilities, including writing a national nuclear smuggling response plan, updating their laws on prosecuting smugglers, and training prosecutors. We also help partners develop nuclear forensic capabilities, facilitate nuclear forensic cooperative relationships, and establish their national nuclear forensic libraries. And we also fund very specific projects that focus, for example, on securing radiological sources at home, monitoring open borders between fixed border crossing points, supporting their development of national response plans, strengthening nuclear forensics capabilities. Let me mention, finally, one more acronym, the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, GICNT, is a joint initiative of the United States and Russia that works on the political level, seeks to obtain the commitment of other countries that they will prevent, detect, and respond to nuclear terrorism. We have 85 partners under GICNT, including 47 of the 53 nations that were at the Seoul Nuclear Security Summit. And they've all endorsed the statement of principles that they will improve accounting, control, and protection of nuclear and radiological materials. They'll develop their capabilities to detect and halt illicit trafficking. They will prevent non-state actors from acquiring these materials, and they will update their laws to counter such activity. The GICNT has 3 working groups: nuclear forensics and nuclear detection, and the 3rd working group is nuclear response to nuclear radiological emergency. Let me mention just one other point that doesn't have initials, but that is an important area of scientific discipline on which we are putting more emphasis, and that is nuclear forensics. We see great potential in this field because it helps to facilitate necessary cooperation between governments investigating different but related phases of nuclear security events. We're building the cooperation in advance by developing nuclear forensic cooperation so that in more important emergencies, we have those relationships in place. So let me just close by saying all of these initiatives that I've described have been endorsed by the Nuclear Security Summit Work Plan. More importantly, in our experience, they have demonstrated their value in bringing up the quality of the game among our partners, among those most likely to experience an episode of nuclear smuggling. We've done it with a relatively small amount of funds and can point to instances where the investment of our expertise and a little bit of money have made a dramatic difference in the capabilities of key partners. I'll close. I may have to leave before 11, but let me point out that the actual expert from our bureau is here, Michael Curry, who is the chief of our nuclear smuggling response team, and if I need to go, he'll be here to both comment and answer questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Do you want to go?
Okay, thanks, Richard, and I want to thank the Hudson Institute and also the Connect US Fund for sponsoring this event. I'm going to take a somewhat higher approach to this, more like 30,000 feet than from the grassroots, what's happening at the program level. And what I'd like to do is talk about one big problem that I think we have and then try to outline several steps that might get us to where we want to end up on nuclear security. And I think that the most significant problem that we have in the nuclear security area these days is that we don't know where we want to end up. So I think as Tom just laid out, there's a lot of different programs in the Departments of State and the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense and in other agencies as well related to nuclear smuggling and security and a variety of other different aspects of this. But I don't think we've identified where it is that we want to end up at the end of this process. And I think our objective needs to be to prevent weak links from existing inside the global nuclear security system. And I think the challenges in achieving this are twofold. First, identifying the weak links and then fixing them when the international system in this area emphasizes sovereignty and national responsibility rather and lacks effective mechanisms for transnational information exchanges and interactions that are not invited by the host country. And the second is to try and increase international confidence, which really means we're going to have a better balance between sovereignty and responsibility for materials inside a country with international responsibility and the impacts of the unauthorized release of radiation. I think we have had very useful 2 summits on this subject at high levels, but I think essentially they've been focused on the easiest actions rather than the most effective actions in this area. So I think there's an evolution of the system that needs to take place over time, and I'm going to outline 5 different steps that I think will help us get there. And one thing I just like to say at the outset is, I think what we need in this area is not just viable actions, but I also think we need vision about what it is that we're hoping to achieve at the end of this process. Because I think If you don't know where it is, I just read this obituary of this poor Zig Ziglar, where he said, you know, if you don't know where you're aiming, you hit the target every time. And I think that that's exactly right. I think we don't know where we're aiming, and I think it's easy to claim credit for success when you don't know what it is that you're trying to do. And I think we need to get clear on that. So the first step that I would put forth to you is I think we need to clarify what the definition of nuclear security is. The Prague speech, President Obama said, we need to secure all vulnerable nuclear materials in 4 years. That was the starting point for the Washington summit. But it's actually a very narrow definition of nuclear security, and I think it's expanded. For example, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, says that they define it as a much bigger issue, including theft, sabotage, unauthorized access of, but include nuclear material, radioactive substances, and associated facilities. In Seoul, the Nuclear Security Summit last March actually expanded on the Washington scope fairly significantly because it included radiological sources and the interface between nuclear security and nuclear safety as much higher profile issues than they were previously. So while fissile material is important and security of fissile material is what is obviously at the core of a lot of this, I think that safety, security of nuclear materials, radiological materials, and nuclear facilities are the scope that we need to be talking about when we talk about what nuclear security is. And I think part of that is what happened in Fukushima, which clearly illustrated that, and the terrorist attack against the nuclear reactor of the sort that nature caused in that case could cause serious problems from the standpoint of radiation. The second step, so once, if we can get clarity on what the definition is, and by the way, I don't think that there's much controversy about this. I think the nations at the Nuclear Security Summit essentially embraced the scope of this, and I think that in the Dutch summit, probably they will as well. Maybe not explicitly, but certainly in a de facto way. The second step is to universalize the current regime. If you look at what's been put forth as the current regime, it's 2 or 3 international agreements, plus, you know, this amorphous role for the International Atomic Energy Agency, plus taking some steps as it relates to fissile material, which I think Miles is going to talk about. But we went through, in preparation for a meeting that we have of a new group called the Nuclear Security Governance Experts Group, and we put together a checklist of about 55 different activities that countries should actually be participating in and implementing. And it breaks down into treaties, resolutions, and international agreements, compliance or implementation of the IA Nuclear Security Series, which is completely voluntary, and it's not at all clear who's following those guidelines. Following the Nuclear Security Fundamentals document that the IAEA produced and that has a new version, taking advantage of IAEA services and programs, of which there are more than just physical protection, and then other mechanisms, some of which Tom mentioned, including the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, the G8 Global Partnership, Proliferation Security Initiative, et cetera, et cetera. So there's actually a lot more that countries could be doing, and we don't have any checklist like this that any country is submitting to the Nuclear Security Summit or to any other institution that simply and clearly identifies what it is that they're doing on nuclear security. So if we could get universalization of reporting, even at that very low checklist level, I think that would be very useful. Let me just say one thing about checklists. If you look at other industries, they're used extensively, and they're used extensively for the purpose of improving standards of baseline performance, which is exactly what we want in this area. A third step is to adopt this culture of continuous improvement. If you look at what countries have been saying in part of the summit process and other places, they're talking about best practices. Well, you know, best practices vary, and it's not clear to me how best practices are constantly defined. But I think this culture of continuous improvement, where you identify what you're hoping to achieve, take steps to get there, redefine what next needs to be done, I think is is something which would be very, very useful. And I think that this is primarily political and a personnel challenge. I don't think that it is a technical challenge. In fact, I don't think there's anything in this area that's a technical challenge, with the exception perhaps of nuclear power, which is a new field. I mean, most of what we're talking about here is political will. It's not technological impossibility. So one way of looking at this culture of continuous improvement is to look at another nuclear area where we've actually made quite a bit of progress, though it's not perfect progress, and where there are concepts that I think are applicable to nuclear security, and that is nuclear safety. And there are several things in nuclear safety. First of all, the industry, governments, everyone is completely conversant with and comfortable with the nuclear safety regime. So things like regularized assessments, information sharing, peer review, convention implementation reviews, and strong industry financed organizations that provide oversight and input, I think are really important and useful concepts that could be transferred to nuclear security. If you look at nuclear safety, and I'm just going to give two examples, the most recent reports from Japan, from TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, on Fukushima, and the results of the EU's stress tests, even in an area which is clearly identified as more advanced than nuclear security, which is nuclear safety, they found that there's a need for continuous monitoring and improvement beyond what the current rules say. Greater harmonization of standards across borders and inspection. Information sharing. Complacency, insularity, and lack of regulatory independence are not conducive to nuclear safety. And then this whole concept that innovation, taking action to improve, is somehow something that is going to end up with penalties. If you look at the TEPCO report, they specifically say, we did not implement safety improvement at Fukushima because we thought we would be sued, because then the people who are watching us closely would say your safety is not adequate. I think that's a bizarre concept, frankly, and I think we should find a way to make sure that innovation is not penalized politically or economically. Additionally, in this area, I think there is a very important concept of incentives that hasn't yet been applied. If you look at the voluntary actions that a number of other countries, and a number of other industries in the United States and in other countries take, there are 4 or 5 different incentive-based reasons why they go above and beyond what their regulatory requirement is and what the legal requirements are. Their accreditation and certification, financial benefit, including aid, tax credits, profits, cost savings, and reputational enhancement. Those are the 3 major reasons that industries do that. And if you look at the industries that do that, it includes things that are very similar in scope to nuclear, in the sense that they serve the public and they also have high risk. It includes the airline industry, includes chemical industry, medical, etc. So it's not a foreign concept to apply this incentive-based concept to nuclear security. And in this regard, I think that this concept of continuous improvement at the next summit or outside of the next summit, I think countries should continue to make unilateral, multilateral commitments to do more, which is, under the summit process at least, called the gift basket and house gift process. The 4th step is to foster necessary political and institutional evolution. You know, when you go to these summits, people are constantly complaining, I don't have enough people to send to all of these different meetings for all of this alphabet soup of activities that's going on. So maybe what we ought to do is streamline that regime. And another first step in this that we've taken is to put together a matrix of all of the major activities that countries can participate in that are multilateral, and then to analyze them across what it is that they do and try to figure out where the overlap is. I think streamlining the regime is actually a very useful step that could be taken. And there's 4 basic categories: UN activities, IAEA, ad hoc, and US government. The second is, as this summit process, enthusiasm and energy associated with it begins to dissipate, there's a question of where should it end up. and the IAEA seems to be one of the prime candidates for accepting it. But I think if you give this to the IAEA without empowering it more, I'm not sure what result you're going to get out of it that's better than what we have today. They don't have enough money to do this. They don't have enough independent decision-making capacity. They need more power, more latitude, and more funding if they're going to take this issue on. Third, related to that is whether the Nuclear Security Summit lives, dies, is on life support, or whatever happens after The Hague, I think we need another parallel political track to what goes on in the IAEA for a variety of different reasons. It will help maintain momentum. It will supplement from a political level what the IAEA does on a technical and political role. It will provide a multilateral forum as opposed to universal forum. It will avoid the NPT politics, which are always mixed up in what the IAEA does. It will also allow the industry, nuclear energy industry, and the expert community, which have been major participants around the margins of these summits, to continue to remain involved. And it will be a process which is not bound by some of the same problems that the IAEA does. Finally, the ultimate goal. I think what we really need is a permanent, cohesive, comprehensive international instrument that basically says, here's what you need to be doing if you're going to be a good global citizen on nuclear security. I don't see this as something which needs to be done today, tomorrow, at the summit in The Hague. I think all of these things that I'm talking about should be done over a continuum, over a period of 10 years. But at the end of that 10-year period, roughly, I think we should end up with something which arrives at a better state than where we are today. Now, this framework agreement idea has got more critics than I have enemies. It's impossible to really believe that, but it's true, numerically. So I think that there's a lot of people that don't like this idea, but I have to say, for the people that do like it, the more people that don't like it, it doesn't scare them. It makes them actually think that they have a good idea. And so I don't think that anybody that's really supporting this idea is going to back away. This idea is here, and it's going to be on the table, and it's going to be an issue on the summit in 2014. At the very least, it's going to be an issue that the press is going to talk about because people are going to talk to the press about it. So let me just conclude by saying, I think we have a real opportunity over the next several years to substantially improve nuclear security regime and to make significant strides toward these end goals, if we can define what the end goals are, as I think. I don't think we can afford to continue to play small ball, where we accelerate the implementation of activities that have been going on since the Bush administration, continue to underfund this agenda as this administration has since the beginning. I don't think we can continue to focus on tiny little incremental improvements, as important as they may be, without thinking about the big picture. We need better leadership, both in a developed and a developing world. And in my opinion, I think this issue of nuclear security has the ability to transcend the awful politics of the NPT, because it's based on responsibility. If you're more responsible, your access to nuclear technology is going to be greater. It's responsibility beyond the rules. And I think if we just focus on improving the current regime, which is clearly inadequate, we're not going to end up where we want to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Apropos your idea, I recall what I think it was Nietzsche who said, "If what doesn't kill you makes you stronger." So I guess that's your approach to your idea. So,
Yes, I'm not dead yet.
Yeah, no, your idea. So.
It's not dead yet.
Yeah, that's right. Go ahead, Miles. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks for hosting this event. I'm going to talk about materials security, particularly focusing on the two kinds of nuclear materials, HEU and plutonium, and radiological security. I know for most people here are pretty versed in this, but there may be a few just to talk about why these matter. HEU is the material that was used in the bomb on Hiroshima. Plutonium was material that was used in the bomb on Nagasaki, and radiological sources would be the material that would be used in so-called dirty bombs that provides radiological devices that terrorists could use, and are fairly accessible to the public. So I'm going to talk about each of those three areas and then some suggested steps to take in them. First, HEU has been, civilian HEU, I should say, is the most critical material to keep from terrorists because, basically you don't need to test a nuclear device using this material. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was not tested before it was used. If you build a simple gun-type device, you can use HEU for that purpose. And this is probably the area the most steps have been taken, particularly with the lead of the United States around the world, but there still needs more to be done in that area. The summits have called for minimizing HEU, securing it, and taking steps towards elimination, but there's still a lot of material out there. In fact, only 1/3 of the HEU-powered facilities around the world have been shut down, and not actually the ones that use the most material, which are critical assemblies, which are testing materials where places where you test reactors, the ability to operate reactors using materials, and so on. There's also there was an effort to at the 2012 summit to put forward HEU guidelines. There's guidelines now for the management of plutonium. The idea was to have similar guidelines for HEU, but this was shot down by a number of countries. And it was sort of punted to the IAEA, which has never been willing to take up the issue. There's also the issue of HEU use in medical isotope production. These are isotopes that are used for various diagnostic scans and so on. And some of the producers around the world use HEU in this process, even though there's the technology has come forward where you can now use LEU, to low enriched uranium, the same material that's used in civil reactors, to produce these medical isotopes. So, and then there's also some particularly hard cases in the area of minimizing and eliminating HEU. We had an agreement that the U.S. Negotiated with Belarus in 2010 that would have removed the material from Belarus to Russia. And unfortunately, because of the problems surrounding the elections in Belarus, where it cracked down on the political opposition and the Western governments initiated sanctions, Belarus pulled out of that effort. In addition, South Africa, which at one time had a nuclear weapons program, has maintained hundreds of kilograms of this material and has not been willing to part with it, using this as partly as leverage in its sort of attempts to encourage more nuclear disarmament by the countries like the United States. One question that really hasn't gotten a lot of attention at the summit, but really needs to get more, is the issue of separated plutonium. That's sort of mentioned cursorily in some of the documents, but governments haven't been willing to tackle this. Basically, what you have is a number of countries have reprocessing programs where they take spent nuclear fuel and they separate out the plutonium to reuse it again in nuclear energy and nuclear power plants. The problem is that they're separating the material much faster than they're using it. These are particularly France, the UK, Russia, and Japan. The Japanese case is particularly worrisome right now because even as they've started come out with a national strategy that talks about phasing out the use of nuclear power, they still want to move ahead with reprocessing. So they're going to basically be separating large amounts of separated plutonium, adding to the tons and tons of the material they already have, enough for thousands of nuclear weapons, but without any place to actually burn the recycled fuel. President Obama actually, in a speech that didn't draw enough attention, I think, in some ways, in terms of this remark, talked about the fact that we can't go on accumulating the separated plutonium around the world and adding to these large totals. Radiological source security. This is sort of the issue that was first brought up at Seoul, but tends to get the least amount of attention from governments and the least amount of funding. Whenever there's a cut in congressional appropriations, this is where it tends to hit. What you've got is a number of sources. It's about 4 to 7 sources you can name that are in common commercial use that have particularly high amounts of radiation if they're used in dirty bombs. And there's not enough. A lot of these materials are out of. They're called orphan sources. They're not known where they are. They're not accounted for. There's a lot of material that's not properly secured. And there's some of these areas where there could be technical alternatives to what we use now that would be a lot safer than what we've got. But there hasn't been a lot of money or political attention put into this issue. And so we also don't have very good standards for ensuring that they're secured to the right level. I mean, one issue that I'll talk about a little more, which deals with this, is there's one of the international conventions that's out there, is a Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, which had an amendment in 2005, which needs many of the countries that signed up to the original convention to endorse it before it can enter into force. And this would have some standards in place, although they would not be legally binding, but they're not even voluntarily in place right now. And the U.S. Senate right now is considering legislation that would implement this amendment, but it's not clear. Well, there's an amendment to the defense bill pending on this issue, but it's not clear if the Senate will actually act on it. So it's very important it does. The House has passed legislation in this regard, and we need the implementing legislation for the U.S. to approve this amendment, and then for that to encourage other countries to do it so this amendment enters into force. So some suggestions in the areas of material security. When it comes to this issue of using HEU for medical isotopes, there's enough technology right now that we just need to set a date at the summit process for ending the production of using HEU for the medical isotope production. We need either the advancement of these HEU guidelines, these requirements for how you manage HEU, or provide transparency about it, either international requirements that are like the plutonium guidelines, or we need voluntary code of conduct, or both, which countries and stakeholders can agree to. We need to address the South African and Belarusian HEU stocks. In terms of U.S. policy, the Department of Health and Human Services put out a proposed rule earlier this year on this issue of medical isotope production, of basically providing incentives to, with Medicare, Medicaid, so on, to use the non-HEU based medical isotope production. An appropriate rule has to enter into force in January. And Congress, the Senate passed legislation last year that would deal with some of the aspects of medical isotope production, providing incentives for LEU-based production, particularly dealing with waste treatment and other issues. Unfortunately, the House hasn't acted on the legislation. Ideally, that would take place in the remainder of this session. That's probably unlikely, but at least next year we need to move forward with that. In terms of plutonium, are there ways that the summit process can really start to tackle this issue? Can we set some sort of cap on the amounts of plutonium that each country can have, or the capacity to reprocess? Can we include some clear minimization language on plutonium stocks? Can we try to prevent reprocessing where there's no market for the fuel that would be used from the separated plutonium? Can there be some kind of gift basket, this kind of concept of a joint pledge by a number of countries on this issue? And can something be done about the Japanese stocks in particular, given what's happening there? On radiological sources, all that's being talked about in the summit process, from what I understand right now, is taking what's a voluntarily code of conduct on radiological sources and trying to make it legally binding. That's not enough. What can we do beyond that? Can we encourage countries to take back There's only a few countries that actually provide these radiological sources, countries like the United States, like Russia. Can we encourage steps to take back this material to the countries that supply it? Can we look for ways to nurture innovation, to look for alternative sources to these high-risk sources? Can we use, one thing that we're working on is, can social media be used to track down and identify these orphan sources, these sources that are out of accounting? And what will it take to get this amendment to the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material entered into force? Can we get this through Congress, and then can we get other countries to sign up to the amendment? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Since you have to leave early, why don't we let you ask people ask questions? You can also email me questions at Weitz, my last name, WEITZ, at hudson.org for online viewers. And we have a Twitter sign, but I don't recall it offhand. I think it's Hudson. Is it at Hudson Institute? Yeah. Okay, so it's at Hudson Institute, and I'll get those. So any questions for Tom Country? Let's go ahead with those, and then we'll continue.
Greg Thielman, Arms Control Association. Miles brought up the nuclear terrorism treaties pending before Congress. I wonder if you, Tom, could give us the administration expectations for the lame duck session, or what the plan is for finally getting these treaties ratified.
Yeah, great question, and on the top of my head these days. So thanks. We're pleased that the House passed the necessary implementing legislation that would allow us to complete the ratification process. Both the UN Secretary General and IAEA Director General Amano have contacted all the countries, including the US, that need to complete the ratification process, urging us to do it for all the reasons that Miles outlined. The House has done it. In the Senate Judiciary Committee, there is some disagreement about a couple of provisions. We are trying to encourage action within the Senate Judiciary Committee so that they could complete that task in the current session of Congress quickly. And of course, the simplest way to do it is to adopt the House version of the legislation. We could go straight to approving it without having to go to a conference committee. If it's not finished in this session, need to start over again in January, and obviously that's not our preference at all. But it is one of many top priorities for the administration in this current session, and it's certainly the top priority for my bureau and my boss, acting under Secretary Gadamer in this session.
Hi, I wanted to give you a chance.
Could you give your name?
Sorry,
and that,
Kenny Fletcher with Nuclear Weapons and Materials Monitor. I wanted to give you a chance to respond to some of Mr. Luongo's comments, sort of suggesting that that there was a lack of a clear goal or objective in this arena, and so maybe you could define sort of what your goal is, what the administration's goal is in this arena, and also I guess the clearest thing that we've heard so far is the 4-year goal to secure vulnerable materials around the world. Where are we on that? Is that something that you would consider that we're on track for success next year as that comes up?
Thanks for that opportunity. Look, I liked everything Ken said. There's bits of it I might quibble with, but I think it's all on point. In terms of definition, what do we mean by nuclear security? It is, well, I think systemically, it's an old tension between a correct effort to have a good, comprehensive definition. And that is exactly what academics, NGOs, big thinkers on the topic should be pushing us to do. And then the recognition that in a political bureaucratic culture, You actually scare people off if you are too ambitious, making too comprehensive a definition. I'm actually impressed by how ambitious the Nuclear Security Summit process has been and how well it has attracted support from a wide range of nations. But I would certainly acknowledge that it hasn't yet given the more comprehensive definition of nuclear security that Ken is absolutely right to advocate. I love the Matrix, and I want a copy of that as soon as possible. It is a fact that streamlining can help. There are very few other governments that can devote the kind of human resources and expertise to those 55 different tasks the way that the United States can. And I wouldn't be surprised if we are not performing adequately on all 55. To find a comprehensive framework that enables more countries to participate with enthusiasm and with expertise is an ideal goal. I'm fascinated by the comments about the culture of continuous improvement and how we can foster that within the NSS framework. And I think he did point at the end to the most important question that the NSS process is going to face before and at the meeting in the Netherlands. It is certainly logical on the one hand to transfer authority for this process over to the IA. It's what they do. It's what they should be doing. At the same time, I'm concerned by all the things that Ken mentioned, that the IAEA needs additional funding, it needs additional authority, it needs additional respect from its members. It needs to have the credibility and the technical competence to make its independent judgment stand up. And if we give it a major new assignment without having upgraded budget capabilities and credibility, what are the effects both for the agency and for the NSS process? I think we have to, not just the U.S. government, but all the participants in the process have to consider that question very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Tom.
let me slip away, but Michael Curry is still.
Although you have a former colleague.
I have a couple of former colleagues, Mike.
He was talking about finance now, but
Thanks very much, Mike Kraft. I worked with Tom on counterterrorism, and my question comes partly from that. Could you talk a little bit on the danger of the dirty weapons, dirty bomb issue, especially in the Iranian and Pakistan context? I mean, most of the attention has been on the theory of, missiles or, the kind of bombs dropped by airplanes. And also another aspect which has not been touched on, but working on bioterrorism issues, one of the concepts has been to try to strengthen the resiliency of countries to dealing with a threat, first responders, etc. The theory being to try to make the bad guys realize the game may not be worth a candle. Has that element entered into your discussions, or is that off in a different category?
On the second question, and Mike may want to speak more to this after I slip out. Both building response capabilities and building nuclear forensic capabilities, both of them are aspects of deterrence. The United States I think, leads the world in both capabilities. And the response capability is equally important for a nuclear or radiological event as it is for a biological event. And it is part of our selling point as we seek international cooperation, that both of these capabilities, response and forensics, have an important deterrence effect, even if you can't measure it directly. Nuclear weapons fissile weapons versus radiological weapons, I'm not sure what I can say that's not obvious. It's a lot easier to make a device that with conventional explosive that disperses radioactive material than it is to construct an actual fission weapon. And that's why all the points that Miles made about having genuine security for radiological sources, as well as the capability to detect those sources when they are no longer secured, but now circulating freely, that these are both essential elements of our security. And we think hard about all of them. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Tom. You go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Alex Grigoriev. I'm working for Voice of America. What you can say about black market of fossil materials? You know, is it possible that we'll see new Han network sometime somewhere? You know, what's going on in this sphere? Thank you.
Well, I think, some of the, the AQ Con network, which is somewhat different because that was really providing equipment for enrichment capabilities and so on, rather than nuclear materials per se. Some of those suppliers are still out there, and it's not beyond the scope of possibility that they could be assembled again into other operations. It's not whether that will happen or not. It takes someone to do the organization and so on. But some of these suppliers continue to provide other nuclear weapons programs, I believe, with with equipment, relevant material.
I would only say I think that in terms of the database that the IAEA keeps on nuclear smuggling, the number of incidences have decreased from their high in the mid-90s. But some of them, I think, as Tom pointed out, some of those cases were quite significant because they included highly enriched uranium. So it's something I think that we all need to worry about, though. It's a lot more, it's really more law enforcement kind of an opportunity to improve the situation. And I think from a policy standpoint, it's not something that those that deal with this issue on an operational level are probably more equipped to deal with. Any comments on?
I would agree with those comments as well. I think the IAEA database is one of the more mature ways for governments to understand the phenomenon of materials that are outside control. And I think by and large what we've seen is more incidents in the 90s with larger amounts of material, and recently sort of fewer incidents with smaller amounts of material. But the fact that these incidents still occur is greatly troubling, and why we continue to focus attention.
Is your monitor? Yes, totally off. Okay. Even though
Dan Pollock, with the Zionist Organization of America. This is primarily for Kenneth, I guess. I'm intrigued by your checklist and all that. I'm not clear on what the incentive is, other than to avoid contributing to a nuclear disaster, that countries would have to place themselves on report. It seems to me that it's quite likely that bureaucratically many countries would rather not, in the wake of a nuclear incident, have a history of checklists that indicate that they weren't robust in responding to the international community standards. So is their interest really served, truly, by putting themselves on report with a long history of 5 or 10 years of checklists that would show that they haven't been meeting international standards? Is there that type of thinking going on about this process?
I don't think there's any kind of thinking going on about this process. This was our idea. I don't think the government has given this any thought. Our government, I don't think, has given this any thought. I think what was actually quite surprising to us is when we started to put together the checklist, how many different items there were that were on it. I think you've hit exactly what the problem is. What do we need versus what are countries willing to do? If you actually look at what's on this checklist, if you're doing, let's just leave aside the treaties, the international treaties. If you're doing in one section what the IAEA is suggesting, you're probably doing in most of the in all of the other categories, most of what needs to be done. So I think the problem we have is that there, and part of the problem with the summits is that we're talking and talking and talking, but I'm not sure how much further down the road toward international confidence in this system we're actually getting. So there is going to have to be some level of discomfort that countries are going to have to accept, I think, if we're going to improve international confidence in nuclear security. Do we know what's going on in countries that we worry about? We don't really know. Is there any transparency? There's no required transparency. Is there anything that mandates people to take the recommendations of the IAEA? Nothing. There are no common standards. There are no mandates. There's nothing even in the international agreements that demand that countries take specific actions. So, as we saw in Fukushima, there is an international dimension to nuclear accidents, and there will be for nuclear terrorism as well. Whether it's an economic dimension, which is that it shuts down trade, containers and the like from developing countries, or whether it's radiation that is swept across the border by winds because of something, an accident or something like that. There is an international dimension to this problem, and we don't have in place at present an adequate response to it. And this is not just me talking. I mean, this is the UN Secretary General. The effects of nuclear accidents respect no borders. We must have strong international consensus and action. So how are you going to get there, and how are you going to address these individual countries that don't want to take specific actions? I think the best way is to start with countries that are doing it and make that kind of a norm, and let that be a seal of approval, some kind of a certification of good citizenship in this area, and then let other countries be inside or outside. We do that all the time in the international system. Are you in or are you out? Some countries are comfortable living out. But I think when it comes to this issue of nuclear terrorism, if you're going to be a possessor of special nuclear materials, you're going to be a possessor of radiological materials and dangerous nuclear facilities, then I think you have a higher level of responsibility than countries are currently showing. But I think there is a political and bureaucratic reality, and it's up to governments. That's why I say this is not a technical issue. This is a political issue. And if there was a little bit of leadership, I think we might actually be able to make some progress on this.
And just to follow up on what Ken said, I mean, my understanding was that there was more of an attempt, there was an attempt in the build-up to the 2012 summit to have a more formal accountability mechanism about what countries were doing on various areas, and it was shot down. And instead we got this idea that countries could, you know, could provide reports, but what content of the report was kind of up to them on what they were doing. And it's also, while this issue of, you know, what are called house gifts, you know, individual country contributions and so on, has been one sense of valuable innovation in the process. It's also been, it's sort of like what, you know, what I call the sort of Lake Wobegon effect. I mean, everyone is above average, you know, because if you set your own standard of what you're supposed to do, then everyone passes. And that's kind of what's happened at the Security Summit process. There's no minimum standard.
I haven't received any questions over the internet. Any other questions from the audience, sir?
Michael Rosenthal from Brookhaven National Lab. These are kind of comments, but maybe they're in the, you could respond to them in terms of questions. One is about transferring the nuclear security summits, if I had this right, to the IEA. And I just observed one positive impact of having them outside the IEA, which is when you get common statements from heads of state, then those agreements become kind of state gospel. Representatives at the IEA have already begun to cite their heads of state's agreement as reasons why they can support IAEA initiatives. And to move the summits outside that forum is necessarily to put them at a lower political level and make it easier perhaps to, as Kenneth Luongo said, introduce again NPT politics. Although so in that sense, maybe they don't have to happen so often, but I think there's a very positive aspect of having them where they are. And then I just suggest perhaps you might comment on two notions, which is one could make, and this is responding to Ken Luongo's suggestion about IEA reviews, which can be very effective, is one could make those reviews or a request for them a condition of supply. So the Nuclear Suppliers Group could agree that as a condition of supply, recipients would periodically ask the IEA for peer reviews of safety or physical protection or all of the above. And then there's an idea from safeguards that one could introduce, which is safeguards by design. You could think about, although I have no idea what it means exactly, and maybe no one else does either, the notion of security by design. So the question would be, could you comment on that? Thank you.
I'm just going to comment briefly on the first point. You know, the IAEA has very special status in this area. It is trusted by a lot of countries. It is indispensable in terms of the expertise that it provides, and it's also credible. The problem is that it's not able to require any kind of action. So while there's a political and a technical dimension to what the IAEA does, both of which are important in the concept of universality that they operate under, I think it's important. I think it's equally important that we continue to maintain a parallel political track. The IAEA is going to have a meeting in September, it's not in September, in July, that is going to probably be the first of several, one every couple of years, I think, that they're looking to do, which is going to be at the ministerial level. And I think the idea is that that process could be the inheritor of the Nuclear Security Summit. I think if those meetings operate under the same conditions that the IAEA operates under, I'm not sure what the distinction is going to be other than a special meeting with foreign ministers on nuclear security. I'm not sure how much dynamism will be maintained in that. But I do think they have a role, and I don't think you can deny them that role, and they're going to inherit part of it. There's no question about it. The question is whether or not there's a political will to maintain a parallel political track on this subject where countries can continue to make more dynamic progress, I would say. On the issues of security by design and condition of supply for under the Nuclear Suppliers Group, you know, I think both of those are good ideas, but I think, Miles, you probably have a better sense of that.
You know, I'll talk about the condition of supply. I mean, security design sounds good, but I'm not a nuclear plant designer, so I'm not sure how you do that exactly. On the condition of supply part, I mean, this is some area where I think there could be progress if countries in the NSG were willing to do it. I mean, particularly the big nuclear plant suppliers and so on. I mean, if you look at the NSG has very general rules right now, just calling for, you know, physical protection standards. It doesn't even require the basic IAEA, you know, IMCIRC 225 standard be implemented as part of the transfers of nuclear equipment. And the U.S. is the only country, as far as I know, that has some kind of assurance mechanism when it transfers equipment to see that it's some kind of nuclear security regime is being upheld. It has, you know, called these assurance visits. They're not called inspections. They're they're not often enough. They're not strong enough, but there's at least some method of trying to follow up on the transfers to assure there's security measures in place. So I would think that's an area where I would hope the U.S. and other countries would look to start, you know, can we work as suppliers, since this is where we have leverage and countries depend on us to implement at least the IAEA standards in that area, and maybe require some kind of review, the IPAS reviews or some kind of IAEA review. I was also sort of intrigued to find out, I was in Vienna last week, and the IAEA has about 30 what are called project and supply agreements where the IAEA itself is involved in the transfer of equipment, and it doesn't require any IAEA nuclear security reviews of its transfers. So at the very least, the IAEA ought to start with its own transfers and require its own standard.
It's an issue that nothing's going to get done on if there's not any political leadership, and it's you know, if you read this piece that Tom Friedman had the other day about big ideas in the new administration, I think it's actually, you take away what the ideas that he were putting forth, I think it's a good concept for this administration to start thinking a little bit bigger than they have in the first 4 years.
Lisa Bayes, Schaefer Corporation, and this is a question for Mr. Curry. When Mr. Countryman spoke, he mentioned nuclear forensics as being an important tool for nations to collaborate together to prevent smuggling and nuclear terrorism. And he said that nations were undertaking efforts together to be prepared in case there were some serious event, smuggling or interdiction of materials, for example. And as part of preparation, of course, exercises are very important. I wonder, Mr. Kerr, if you might comment on any exercise activities that nations are undertaking right now in the area of nuclear forensics, or any plans to do so. And also, he mentioned national nuclear forensics libraries, and I wonder if you might just elaborate on what those are and how those are helpful.
Sure. With regard to exercises, I think the primary forum where a lot of international activities occurring in nuclear forensics is in the International Technical Working Group. And this is a group that was started by the G8 in the mid-1990s and has grown over time and now includes about 40 members. And they do hold periodic exercises where they evaluate nuclear materials. They've held 3 what have been called round robins that allow governments to analyze materials and identify best practices. And we've found this ITWG process to be a very robust way to bring government experts together and to identify best practices. And I think a lot of work by this group has been observed and adapted by the IAEA. So that's currently those are the types of exercises that have occurred. I think there's one coming up, and that's in the area of national nuclear forensics libraries. Second, but I think one of the challenges that we face in the area of nuclear forensics, and one of the areas that Assistant Secretary Countryman highlighted that nuclear forensics can provide utility, is this idea that smuggling or nuclear events can be transnational. And so how do you build cooperation among countries? And so forensics is a way to understand material in different phases of an incident. If you think of a diversion, a trafficking, or an illicit end use, the people along those different phases may change, but the materials don't. And so understanding the material at different phases allows cooperation between governments. And so from a State Department, from a foreign affairs perspective, we see this scientific discipline as a way to help foster cooperation. So we're encouraging work done by the Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, international labs to build this type of capability, these core capabilities with other governments. And so the ITWG and the IAEA have been mechanisms to do that. One of the challenges in building this type of cooperation is the ability to share information on materials. And so the question sort of becomes, if you discover material outside control, how do you understand where that material may have come from? And so there's one idea that you could have a centralized international database where everyone would contribute their nuclear material data. And I think that that has proven to be very problematic, very challenging, because of the proprietary and national security concerns related to nuclear materials data. So then the other option will be to have national nuclear materials library. National nuclear materials libraries, where governments can catalog the materials that they've either produced or hold within their territory. So that way, if a government encounters nuclear material that's outside control, smuggled nuclear material, they can answer that initial question: is it my material that the police have found, or is it somebody else's? So if you have a national library, you have the ability to answer that first question about where the materials may have come from, and then you also have a framework. If your neighbors have libraries, you have a common way of communicating and understanding where that material may belong to a neighbor. And so this idea of national nuclear forensics libraries is another way to sort of build cooperation that can help address different phases of nuclear security. Did that answer your question?
Not, there's
On another subject, the reports a little while ago are on Ken's website about Russia either wanting to modify or drop out of the non-Lugar agreements. Can any of you clarify what the status is of that?
all I can say is I've invited the Russian ambassador to speak at Hudson on the topic, and they haven't responded yet. So I guess they're still sorting out their questions. Because ideally, I'd like to get him and Senator Lugar to come and speak at one of our sessions, but neither of them responded. So I think it's probably still under review. Because as you know, it was a very ambiguous statement about, some of them said, we don't want to deal with this anymore. Some said, well, we want a revised version. Others say, well, let's focus on, fold it into the, the global partnership and so on. So Bonnie Jenkins, Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins is going to speak on the 20th here, and she's dealing with that issue somewhat. So we might have an update then. But if you guys want to write to the Russian embassy and encourage the ambassador to come and speak, that would be great. So.
Richard, let me just add one thing. I actually hadn't read the agreement in a while, and I went back and looked at it right around that time, and it is clearly out of date. I mean, I was surprised actually after I reread it that the Russians signed it 5 years ago again. I think it definitely needs to be updated. The question is whether or not the updating and the changes that are going to be required are, in other words, a euphemism for trying to kill it in the cradle. I think that non-Lugar and cooperative threat reduction in general is bigger than U.S. and Russia. I think it's a symbol to the world, and I think it's an example of how other countries can work together both on a bilateral and a multilateral basis. So I think ending that cooperation is a huge mistake from an international security perspective, irrespective of whatever the individual views of the countries are. But I will grant the Russians this. I do think the agreement does need to be updated.
I would also, sort of following up on one of Ken's points, I mean, one positive thing that's been in the Russian statements is the willingness to try to work on third countries on these issues. And I think there's a lot of experience and cooperation that's developed through the programs on these issues, and that should be taken advantage of overseas. So we need to fix the U.S.-Russian direct cooperation, but I think also there's lots of ways that this can be an advantage in the nuclear security process and more generally.
Sorry, do we have another question then? Okay, get away from my bed.
Edmund Reynolds with Citizens to Stop Nuclear Terrorism. Ken, if you've got time, could you just briefly describe the blue sky things that you'd like to see the administration do in the second term?
I have one that's not even blue sky. I'd like them to have a real budget for this agenda. The budgets that have been put forth, the first one was below the last Bush administration budget. The second one was okay. It was cut by the Congress. The third one was below the second year. And they don't go to bat for these when the Congress wants to cut them. I mean, the long pole in the tent is U.S. cooperative threat reduction activity, okay, in this area, in this field, in my opinion. And if that pole folds, be it through the CTR agreement or through budget cuts because of the challenges that we have on a federal budget level, then I think that this whole agenda will begin to slowly crack and crater. And I would hate to see that happen. Not hate to see it happen. I think it would be a huge mistake for that to happen. So I would be very happy if the administration in February put forth a really robust budget that even had some new initiatives in it, which also hasn't been a feature. So I think that those would be two very positive developments that I would like to see. And it's not even stratospheric. It's within the atmosphere of the Earth. I'd have to go back and look at what it is. We break it out differently than the way they do. As we look at some of the specific programs that really are relevant to this, not so much on the material disposition side, but really more on the security side. But certainly, as Miles said, the radiological budget has been cut back over the last several years, and that in and of itself is a major problem.
Yeah, I think we're at the time. So I first of all want to thank very much I want to thank very much Jamie and Perry and Marco for coming to bat. You guys don't know the kind of problems we've had with this event in the last 24 hours, and that's because they did such a great job in helping me manage it. I also want to please join me in thanking the speakers, and I again also want to encourage everybody to come to the future sessions I discussed. Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you.
Hey, Michael, how are you?
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Very well, thank you.
Very good presentation.
Thank you.
By the way, I wasn't suggesting that the idea